as the American century. I'm not going to expect you to know a lot, except for the fact that what you really need to focus on for this particular part of the test is how did these more modern events have some connection to the larger question of American progress or Lincoln's vision of the last best hope of humanity. So let's take a look at the board down there, which we've looked at repeatedly and used in our last history class, and look at what happened from 1945 to 2000, and why there are some key events in that time period that you definitely want to pay attention to in terms of how they relate to the question. Let's start by looking at American foreign policy from 1945 to 2000. What I mean by American foreign policy is I mean America's role in the world during that time. So let's talk about America's role in the world from 1945 specifically to 1990, because that time period is known as the Cold War in American history. And it's a Cold War because after the Hiroshima bombing, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after the atomic bombs are dropped, the world realizes that we've got to a point in technological development that we can't even use the weapons we've invented. Because if we do, we'll destroy the world. That's mutually assured destruction. MAD, M-A-D. Mutually assured destruction. Because once the other side, once the Soviets also get nuclear weapons, then if either of us use those weapons, we'll destroy the world. So you've got to understand something about the causes of the Cold War. The Cold War begins in 1945, and it begins because back in World War I, the Soviet Union was created when Russia fell apart. There was a revolution in Russia, supposedly led by communists who tried to take over and make equality for the working class. That's not really true, though. It was really a dictatorship run by Lenin and Stalin to maintain control over the people and keep them all down, in a sense. So you didn't really have communism, you really had a dictatorship. But at that time, other countries in the world were also shifting towards more socialist policies. So after World War I, and then into the time period of World War II, remember what happens in the world. Capitalism fails in 1930s, 1940s. The Great Depression is a worldwide effect. So because of those failures of capitalism, countries around the world begin turning to socialism, or in some cases, communism. And the U.S. begins to get paranoid that it could happen here too. That's why there were people that were arguing that FDR was a communist, because it was happening in other places. So when you think about that time frame, after World War II, when we team up with the Soviet Union, the USSR, we team up with them against Hitler. But when the war's over, Europe is split in half between the people that were on our side, England and France, the Western European countries, and the Eastern European countries that were there, like in the Soviet sphere of influence. And literally after the war, the Soviets had an opportunity. Because think about what happened. When they came in to invade Germany, they came in from the Soviet Union and brought troops through Poland and Romania and the other Eastern European countries. They just left their troops there. And on the other side, there are American troops. So the Soviets, after the war, felt like we've now had a series of events that have devastated Russia. Napoleon invaded way back in the 1800s. World War I left millions of people dead. World War II left millions of people dead. Millions of Russian civilians. So the Russians were like, we're never letting this happen again. And we're going to create a boundary between the Western European countries and the rest of Russia, the Soviet Union. And they created the Soviet bloc, or the Warsaw Pact. They basically created the Iron Curtain, which is the sort of euphemism for the dividing line between the West, the democratic countries like England and France, and the communist countries like Poland and Romania and Eastern Germany, etc. So Europe is literally divided in half. It's divided by communism and freedom, communism and democracy. And so Truman becomes president when FDR dies of a stroke in 1945. And one of the things he does is he says, we're going to pursue a policy where we're not going to let communism spread anymore. That policy is known as the Truman Doctrine, or containment, it's better known as. Okay? Containment. We're going to contain communism. That policy is going to shape American policy all the way to 1990. Okay? That's the policy of the Cold War. So if you put it in the context of our larger question, how can you argue that that fits Lincoln's vision?
America being like the last protector of the world for freedom.
That's right. Perfect, Anush. That America is the last defender of freedom in the world. That our job in the world is to protect and defend freedom. Okay? But if you look at it from the Soviet side of things, you got to sort of see like they have been abused repeatedly and they want protection. So one of the things that happens right away in Truman's administration is what happens to Berlin. Because if you think about it, if this is Germany, okay, if this is the state of Germany, that's the map of Germany, and you divide Germany in half and you say this half belongs to the Western powers, the democracies, and this half belongs to the Soviets, the communist side, there's a big problem. Berlin is right there in the side that belongs to the Soviets. But Berlin is symbolic. It's the capital of Germany. So the U.S. was not willing to give it up. So what they decided in a peace agreement after World War II was that we would divide Berlin by the four powers that fought in the war. England, France, the U.S., and the Soviets. So those are the four winning sides in the war against the Germans and the Italians. So we divided Berlin into four quadrants. Three of them were democracies. So you have the French section, the American section, and the British section are democracies. So if you think about that, we color in the area that belongs to democracy, it would look like that. Now there's a problem. In the middle of communism, you have a tiny little oasis of freedom. All these people that are in the communist section are going to see McDonald's and blue jeans and all these great things that are coming out of America in this little section. The Soviets can't allow that. That little seed of freedom in that infertile area of communism will cause the communist section to collapse. So very smartly, what do? They decide to contain the freedom inside of a wall. And that wall is the Berlin Wall. So the Berlin Wall was actually built to basically keep the freedom contained within that communist section. That's what it was for. So some people get confused about the Berlin Wall, about who built it or why. It was built by the Soviets to contain the free section. When people tried to jump the wall, they weren't jumping out, they were jumping in. So the people from the bad section of Germany were trying to jump into the free section and escape from that intolerance. Right early on with the Berlin Wall crisis, Truman faced a real problem. The Soviets at first decided, we just have to get rid of this. We have to just erase it from the map, not let it be there at all. So they basically cut it off. And they say, we're not going to allow any shipments of any products on roads that lead to Berlin because those roads pass through the communist section. So the Soviets try to block it off. Truman says, if you do that, we're going to fly planes over and drop supplies into that area. The Soviets say, if you fly into our space, we're going to shoot down your planes. Truman says, if you shoot down our planes, that's World War III. So right from the beginning, we have this tense conflict, and both sides kind of back down. The Soviets give up and say, all right, fine, we'll just build a wall around it instead. And that's why the Berlin Wall was created. The Berlin Wall is symbolic of the Cold War. It's symbolic of the division. Okay? And that Berlin Wall will stay up until 1990. And the fall of the Berlin Wall will actually be the symbolic end of the Cold War. But we'll get to that in a second. Okay? So right from the beginning, this tense point-counterpoint is going on. Truman serves the rest of FDR's term and then runs for his own. He doesn't run again in 1950. Eisenhower, the great hero of World War II, recruited to be a Republican candidate. No one really knew what political party he believed in, but he ends up joining the Republican Party, runs for president, wins in 1950, and is a very popular president. This whole period of I like Ike is this sort of happy time in American history. The 1950s is the time that America sort of seems to be everything's great, it's happy, mom and dad live in the suburbs with their 2 kids and their dog named Spot and the white picket fence, and everything's happy. Okay, that's when you have TV sitcoms like father knows best and leave it to Beaver, sort of representing the happy American family. Okay? But at the same time, there's some kind of un-American things going on here. The House Un-American Affairs Committee forms. Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin runs and becomes a senator, and he basically makes a name for himself by saying he's going to root out communists in the American government. That's why the House Un-American Affairs Committee is formed, to investigate suspected communists. Those of you that have seen or were in The Crucible last year, that play was written by Arthur Miller right in this time period because he was criticizing the government witch hunts against communists. You could definitely compare the witch hunts against communists back to the Salem witch trials. Very similar parallels there. So basically this period of time sort of shows that it wasn't all so great. So what if there are communists in America? That's a political ideology. You can see that there's a little bit of a problem because we're fighting this Cold War against the Soviets. Anybody that might have a socialist or communist ideology is considered an enemy of the state, which is, in some ways, I think there's some similarities to American Muslims today, right? In the war on terror, like Muslim Americans are sometimes criticized or suspicious, like treated suspiciously because of their religious beliefs. But it's sort of an un-American thing if you think about that. Eisenhower becomes president. He's president during this time period. I think this is an important piece to consider, is we'll talk about in a second, excuse me, is the counterculture, but we'll get to that in a minute. So through Eisenhower's presidency, he continues fighting the Soviets by sort of supporting freedom around the world. There's no real open, outright conflict. But what happens in the mid-1950s is on the island of Cuba, there is a revolution there. And you might have seen the pictures of Che Guevara and Fidel Castro lead a revolution in Cuba. They overthrow the government there and install a communist government in Cuba. So Che Guevara and Fidel Castro create communism in Cuba. Now communism has spread to our backyard. It's literally just across the water from Florida. It's really close. And Eisenhower begins plotting a plan to get rid of Castro, to throw the communists out of Cuba. He's going to invade Cuba and throw them out. Okay? He doesn't get the plan in place until he's just about to leave office, and he leaves after 2 terms, and JFK wins the presidency in 1960. So JFK, this young Democrat, sort of this vision of hope for America. He's got a young wife, 2 little kids. This period of time is known as Camelot. It was like this happy, perfect American family becomes president of the United States. He's young, he's energetic. It's like a whole new generation taking over. And it's sort of the height of hope after all this stuff that's gone on. JFK, first year of his first term, ends up with a crisis called the Bay of Pigs because he inherited the invasion of Cuba from Eisenhower. He wants to prove himself. He's a young guy. He's a Democrat. He wants to prove he's tough on communists. So he launches a CIA invasion of Cuba called the Bay of Pigs. And it's a complete disaster. Completely falls apart. The Cuban exiles that we were training to invade Cuba, somebody rats them out and tells Castro they're coming. So Castro's army's waiting on the beach, and as they arrive, they all just get massacred. So at that point, JFK sort of has to go on TV and say, my bad, like I totally screwed up. Even though it was Eisenhower's plan, JFK gets the blame for it. And everyone thinks he's a terrible president, he doesn't know what he's doing, he's too young, never should have elected him, and there's all this question about him in 1961. Is he really up to the job? So that leads to this period because it looks like JFK's weak. And it looks like the Soviets have an opportunity here. So what the leader of the Soviet Union decides, Khrushchev, he decides to put missiles in Cuba. Missiles that could strike the United States. Now keep in mind, at this point, there are no missiles yet developed that can fly from the Soviet Union all the way to America. They could fly into Europe and destroy like England and France and the Western European powers, but there's no missiles that could actually strike us until this. So in 1962, there's this event called the Cuban Missile Crisis, where now JFK has to stare down the Soviets, and basically JFK says, you can't put missiles there. If you put missiles there, we're going to launch an invasion of Cuba. Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, says, if you invade Cuba, we're going to fire on you and there's going to be World War III. So the closest the world ever came to nuclear destruction happens in October of 1962 because there's a game of chicken. The missiles are on boats. They're on their way to Cuba. Kennedy says, you're not putting those missiles on the mainland. He sets up a blockade of Cuba with American naval ships guarding Cuba and says, if you cross this line, our ships will fire on your ships. The Soviets say, if you fire on our ships, war is initiated. So there's this really tense moment in October. It's this period of time known as the 13 days, and it was the closest we came to nuclear destruction. Kennedy refuses to blink, refuses to stop, back down. He actually gets so close as firing warning shots across the bow of these Soviet ships. Khrushchev blinks and says, we're not going to go to total nuclear destruction over a little island in the Caribbean. It's not worth that. So Khrushchev backs down. The Soviets agree to remove the missiles and remove the missile parts as long as Kennedy promises not to invade Cuba and get rid of Castro, which is essentially what happens. So Kennedy then becomes popular. He saved the world from nuclear destruction. He, refused to back down. And at the same time, Kennedy is also supporting the civil rights movement. He's starting to support, with his brother Robert Kennedy as Attorney General, the integration of schools in the South. Kennedy becomes a very controversial figure, and in November of 1963, he's assassinated when he's in Dallas on a campaign trip. He's shot. His motorcade is going through Dallas, and Lee Harvey Oswald, the lone assassin, shoots him in the head and kills him. LBJ becomes president of the United States. Lyndon Johnson, former Texas senator, is now president of the United States. Now, think about what's been happening during this time period. Not only are we sort of facing off against nuclear destruction, we're also preventing the spread of communism in other countries. Right after World War II, remember what happened to the Asian countries. A lot of them had been occupied during World War II by the Japanese. So the Japanese had occupied parts of Korea, parts of China, the Philippines. And when the Japanese give up, there's like a power vacuum there. And part of that power vacuum will be filled by communist movements. Both in North Vietnam and in North Korea, you'll have communist governments take control. Now, the Korean War is kind of known as the forgotten war in American history. And what happens during the Truman and Eisenhower administrations is we stop the spread of communism into South Korea. We create a line, basically, where we say, if you're going to be communist, it has to be above this line. The southern area will be democratic. And so that sort of false message that's sent with the Korean War outcome, where we stop the spread of communism, will spread into Vietnam in LBJ's presidency. He wants to try to do the same thing. The problem is in Vietnam, you had a much different situation. And the people of Vietnam probably primarily wanted to be communist. So here's the U.S. trying to sort of, who are we fighting there? Are we fighting the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese? There was a lot of confusion for American forces. And Vietnam, I think, marks a really interesting point where you have to question America's sort of role in the world. So are we the guardians of freedom and democracy, or are we just making sure that the people that we want in power are in power? So in Vietnam, for example, if there had been an election, a free and fair democratic election, the people would have chosen communism. So who are we to tell them, you can't be communist even if you want to be? And so Vietnam is a real black mark, I think. When you start to compare that to other things America's done in the world, I think you can really question America's role here in Vietnam. And because it's on television and everyone sees these bad things we're doing and innocent people getting killed on national television, the American people turn against it. Like things like Woodstock and the Voice of Peace and all the hippies and all that happens at that same time.
So could you say that the Korean War was like a positive event?
Well, I think so, because I think if you look at the Korean War, you can say the South Koreans legitimately wanted protection from the North Korean invasion in a sense. And so when you think about the idea of what America does to help South Korea, it was, I think, welcome, and it was and it worked for that reason. So I think what I would remember of the Korean War is it sort of sets a false message for the United States. There's a little bit of racism here too, frankly, because I think from the United States perspective, oh, they're all Asian, so they're all the same, and we can just lump them all in together. And I think that idea that Vietnam would be the same as Korea, they were totally different. And when you think about, like, the George Washington of Vietnam, a guy named Ho Chi Minh, was a legitimate freedom fighter, really trying to free his people from years of invasions from different countries, whether it was China or Japan or whoever had sort of come in, the French eventually. He just wanted freedom for his people. And in fact, after World War II, Ho Chi Minh wrote to Truman and said, we want to make our Declaration of Independence just like America. Will you help us? And because France was our ally at the time, Truman never even writes back to him. And so who do they go to for help instead? The Soviet Union, who says, sure, we'll give you lots of weapons as long as you're communist. And so that's, in a way, we were responsible for Vietnam turning to communism. And then we turn around and fight it after the fact. So you have all these bad things that happen, like the My Lai massacre, where American troops like slaughter an entire village of women and children. And it really just gives America a really big black eye. Like, how did we get into this mess? How did the country that saved the world in World War II end up doing this awful thing? Okay. And we lose that war. We lose Vietnam. We pull out and Vietnam becomes communist and remains so to this day, more or less. Okay. So when you think about this period after Vietnam, America continues this Cold War mentality until Ronald Reagan is elected in 1980. And Ronald Reagan comes in saying, I'm going to defeat the Soviets once and for all. And he begins a massive spending campaign to build up the American military. Like just incredible deficits, incredible debt that we're going to go into to build new weapons, new missiles, new submarines, new tanks, to really force the Soviets to do the same. Now, if there's one thing about communism that you should remember, that as an economic philosophy, it doesn't work. So the Soviet Union has been trying to keep up with the United States, but it just can't technologically. And by the time we get to the 80s, the Soviet Union's bankrupt. They have no more money. They can't keep up with us anymore. And so the Soviet Union, communism, begins to collapse in on itself. In order to save it, this new guy comes in named Gorbachev, who says, I'm going to reform it. I'm going to save it. I'm going to be the guy that saves the Soviet Union. He's kind of like the FDR of the Soviet Union. He comes in and says, I'm going to save communism by adding a little capitalism. So it's almost like the opposite of what FDR did, right? I'm going to save communism by adding a little capitalism. Can't do that. It doesn't work that way. A little capitalism explodes the system, and the Soviet sort of communist system completely collapses. 1990, they lose control of all their Eastern European states. They can't keep them anymore. They switch and become democratic states. So the Berlin Wall falls. Germany is reunited. East and West is one country again, and it's a democracy, and it's capitalist. So the Soviet Union collapses and becomes Russia again, and ostensibly, more or less, a democratic country and an ally of the United States. So the Cold War falls apart. And that's when George W. Bush, not George W. Bush, the first Bush, George H.W. Bush, becomes president, and he says we now live in a new world order. There is no communist fight anymore. It's a new world. And not long into that new world comes 9/11 and the war on terrorism will begin. So that's sort of the story of America's sort of fight in the Cold War from 1945 to 2001.
Did you say the name was that was the Russian
Gorbachev, Gorbachev, Gorbachev. So when you think about all of that from foreign policy, just looking at that, what are some things you could argue evidence-wise for America during that time period? If you were just looking at foreign policy, not these other things that are happening, but just American foreign policy, how could you use that summary that I just gave you in an argument about sort of America and its role in history?
I like to use counter some foreign intervention as for and against, because it's such a defending democracy freedom, but also what we do that we're failing recognition to the West.
Okay, so I think that's a really good summary. On the one hand, symbolically, we are defending freedom and promoting democracy and trying to help freedom exist in the world. But on the other hand, you can argue that in places like Vietnam, we're actually doing the opposite. We're actually not letting those people be who they want to be because we're so paranoid about the spread of communism. So I think I would argue that the paranoia about the spread of communism that led to some of these bad things like the House Un-American Affairs Committee and Vietnam, I think you can argue is a negative, right? That it really turned us away from our ideals and made us do sort of bad things instead of good things. Even though we were trying to do things for a good reason, we sort of lost our way, I would say. Now, what if we look at the other stuff that's going on in America in that time period? I think if you break it down, you can see from 1950 to 1963 is a really distinct period of positive, sort of happy, America's great, we have this old grandpa as our leader, and everybody likes him, everything's happy, and we have this great country. But at the time, there's a simmering boil of underculture there, of the counterculture. You have people like Jack Kerouac, an author who writes a book called On the Road about going across America and seeing all the people that don't fit in to this happy little culture. We start to see rock and roll, Elvis Presley, Bob Dylan, these people that come in American culture and start singing about the counterculture, that we're not all perfect, that it's not a perfect culture. Okay? So we start to see this counterculture occur, which basically says we aren't all these things that we're supposed to be. After World War II, African Americans come back and start demanding their freedoms. We have the Brown v. Board of Education case that leads to the Civil Rights Movement. Why? Because this case sets the standard for integration, that separate is unequal. So therefore you have people in Little Rock, Arkansas, demanding they get to go to high school. 9 black students that try to go to the white high school. You have people like Rosa Parks, who refuses to move from her seat into the back of the bus. Blacks had to sit in the back of the bus and the front seats were reserved for whites. And Rosa Parks refuses to move. That leads to bus boycotts. That leads to the Freedom Riders, where you have these people that get on buses in like the north and ride through the south in integrated groups. They get beaten on with baseball bats and dogs get sicked on them and fire hoses, and it's all over the news. And John Kennedy, as president, sort of goes on TV and says, no matter what color your skin is, you should have the same rights as everyone else. And he agrees to sort of back up these people, sends in troops to support integration. There's this huge uproar in the South when they try to sort of integrate. The person who leads that fight will be Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a minister in Atlanta at the Ebenezer Baptist Church. He organizes a bunch of other black churches as the source of sort of black pride movement and sort of power for people in the South. And he sort of harnesses the power of these people who are passive resistance. Like Rosa Parks wasn't getting weapons and fighting a revolution. She was passively refusing to move out of her seat. The same thing happens at lunch counters all across the South. People go into these lunch counters, sit down at the counter, and refuse to get up. And the waitresses are like, I can't serve you. And they're like, I'm just going to sit here, and you can't make me move. So that starts to spread all through the South until eventually policies start to change. He'll organize a march on Washington, where he'll give his famous I Have a Dream speech, where he dreams one day of every boy and every girl of every color and every race can achieve the American dream. So this 50s, early 60s looks like a time of great progress and hope. We're actually going to make these changes. Finally, it's going to happen. But then in 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated. April of 1968, he's in Memphis, helping organize a strike, and he gets shot on the balcony of his hotel. He's killed instantly by a sniper from a hotel across the street. Riots break out all across the country. It's an election year. So think about this year is crucial. Lyndon Johnson had become president. He had ushered in these enormous reforms in American government. The Great Society programs did more than the New Deal to create a safety net for people. He pushed civil rights legislation. He built Medicare and Medicaid. He started Head Start for little kids to go to school before kindergarten. So he did all these great things, but he's also fighting in Vietnam, and he's dealing with all this stuff that's happening. The Vietnam War has turned bad. The news reports are saying, oh, this is a terrible war. Look at all these awful things we're doing. So in 1968, Johnson says, I'm done. I'm not running for president again. I'm walking away from it. This stunning announcement. Nobody expects it. He goes on TV and he says, I will not be a candidate for president in 1968. I refuse to run again. So it wide opens the race for president, and the former president's brother, Robert Kennedy, jumps into the race and says, I'm going to run. I'm going to end the Vietnam War. I'm going to fix civil rights. I'm going to finish my brother's legacy. I'm going to fix what he didn't fix. That's the campaign poster for Robert Kennedy right there, next to the I like Ike button. And Robert Kennedy, 2 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., in fact, 45 years ago tomorrow, Robert Kennedy wins the California primary for president. He's on his way to sort of working toward the nomination, and he's giving a speech, an acceptance speech. He leaves the ballroom. As he walks through the kitchen, a guy walks up and shoots him in the head. He collapses. He doesn't die immediately, but his brain swells up and he gets an infection. He dies the next day. So Robert Kennedy is assassinated in June of 1968. And when that happens, the whole country is sort of like, what is happening here? We've lost John Kennedy. We've lost Martin Luther King. We've lost Robert Kennedy. It really begins, I think, a period of great cynicism in American life, that government can't work, that these things don't work properly. And that's followed 2 years later, really, I guess 4 years later, by Watergate, where the president, Nixon, who was elected when LBJ didn't run and Robert Kennedy was killed, Nixon wins the presidency, and he's so paranoid about his enemies that he actually breaks into the Democratic Party headquarters and puts like bugs in the office so he can hear what their plans are against him. The ironic thing is there were no good Democratic candidates that really had a chance to beat him, but he was so paranoid that he committed crimes to make sure he could sort of stay in power. And the Watergate scandal erupts because some newspaper reporters find out about it and basically start tracing it back. And the reason they found out, pretty simple. The guys that broke into the offices of the Watergate building where the Democratic Party headquarters were, they were all wearing business suits when they broke into the office, and they were arrested. The men who were arrested had little address books on them. These reporters start going through the address books and calling everybody in the address books. There's one entry in one of the guys' address books that says WH. They dial the number, and the White House answers the phone. So that connects the criminals to the White House and leads to this Watergate scandal that eventually leads to President Nixon resigning. The only president in American history to ever resign from office. Nixon resigns in 1972, and Gerald Ford becomes president. Gerald Ford is the only man to ever be president of the United States that was never elected. Okay, now, listen what I mean. He was not Nixon's VP when Nixon was elected president. He was appointed because Nixon's original VP got involved in another scandal and had to resign. So Ford is appointed to the presidency and then becomes president of the United States without ever having to win an election. He never was elected as a VP or a president, and he becomes president of the United States. And he only lasts until 76 when Carter is elected. And that sort of period of Watergate, we move beyond it. Reagan comes in 80 and says, I'm going to make America feel good about itself again. It's morning in America again. It helped that he was a movie star. He was an actor. And he could give a great speech, and he was funny. And people were reminded of Eisenhower. Here's this old grandpa again, and he's going to bring us back to the good times. Not only that, it helped that Ronald Reagan played a cowboy in lots of movies that he was in. So people saw, here's this American symbol, and we're going to make him our president, and he's going to, make everything great again. And in fact, in the 80s, the economy does do well, and Reagan's sort of push to outspend the Soviet Union does pretty much work, and so Reagan becomes a really popular and memorable president as a result of that. So that sort of brings you up to this period, which I would say since Reagan, you've had pretty conservative presidents, and I would include Clinton in that. Clinton is a new Democrat. He's not an FDR liberal or a Lyndon Johnson liberal. He tries to be more moderate in the way that he looks at things. And I think you could carry that through all the way to the current president. We're still in this sort of period of conservative wave that, the Tea Party and all that, like what role should government play? Okay. So that gives you an overview of those things. Is there anything on the board that you want me to talk about that I haven't mentioned?
Oh, you mentioned it a little bit. Can you just explain like Great Society?
Sure. The Great Society is what Lyndon Johnson calls his plan for America. So the Great Society follows in the path of the Square Deal, the New Deal, and now we have the Great Society. So the Great Society is government programs to help people, particularly the poor, the underclass. And so he creates Medicare, he creates Medicaid. You know the difference between Medicare and Medicaid? What's Medicare? For? What's the difference between Medicare and Medicaid? That's right. Medicare is for older people. Medicaid is for poor people that are young but don't have enough money for health insurance. So you have Medicare, Medicaid, those still exist today. He pushes environmental reforms like the Clean Water Act and things like that. He creates Head Start for kids to have more like schooling and more education reform. He creates the Modern Student Loan Program for kids to go to college. He pushes for reforms in welfare and unemployment insurance. I mean, it's more liberal programs than the New Deal. But nobody really remembers it that much because LBJ is remembered for the guy that lost Vietnam instead of the guy that created all these modern social programs. Not really. This is an interesting case. We didn't really have time to talk about it. But when you get to this case in 2000, this is the election after Clinton was president. His VP runs, right? Al Gore runs as the Democratic nominee. The governor of Texas, the son of the older President Bush, runs for the Republican nomination. And it's a really close race all the way down to the end. It comes down to Florida. And Gore actually wins the popular vote by like 3 million votes, like overall. Gore has way more popular votes. But it comes down to the Electoral College, and there's a dispute in Florida because there were some questionable ballots in Florida. In fact, the way they designed the ballot in Florida was so confusing that people couldn't figure out who they were voting for. And here's why. They had this ballot that was like 2 pages long. So when you voted, you had to put your ballot into this machine. You like dropped it into this machine. You had this little thing that you punched a hole in for the candidates that you wanted. But the way they organized the ballot was alphabetical, and it listed all the presidential candidates. It had these little holes on the side like this, and the holes had to be in the middle because the way the machine would read the votes. So there were another set of holes on this side. And the way the list was, it was so confusing that you couldn't tell what you were punching for. And the reason we know that is that this guy that was running for president, a guy named Pat Buchanan, was a really conservative Republican, not on the Republican ticket. He was running as a third-party candidate. And he was, by a lot of people thought he was sort of anti-Semitic, that he was sort of against Jews and all this stuff. And so in Florida, there's a huge Jewish population in Florida, like all the elderly people that are retired down there. And we know that these old Jewish people, so many of them accidentally, they were trying to vote for Al Gore, but they accidentally voted for this other guy, and they punched the wrong hole. So when you think about the ballot being really confusing, and then more importantly, sometimes when people punched through, they didn't punch all the way through the hole, and so there was this little thing that, like, it was called the Chad. The little thing that punches through is called the Chad, and the Chad didn't come all the way through, and they would, like, they had what they called hanging Chads, and if the Chad was hanging and it went through the machine, it wouldn't read the vote. So it was such a close race, they had to do a recount and actually look and see how many votes were left. Well, the thing that was happening was it was pretty clear that based on the demographics and the exit polls, so remember, people when they left the voting booth, where they said, "Who'd you vote for?" And the old lady said, "I voted for Al Gore," but then her vote didn't count somehow. There was some problem. So the exit polls showed Gore winning, and the news stations declared Gore the winner. But then when the votes started getting counted, they're like, wait a minute, there's a big disconnect between what these people said they voted for and what the actual result was. So it came down to, in Florida, the 2000 presidential election, as they're counting the votes, the state Supreme Court says, we've got to have more time. We've got to give the counties more time to count the votes and look at each individual ballot and hold it up to the light and see where the Chad is hanging and who got that vote. Because they were within 300 votes of the millions cast. Bush and Gore were within 300 votes in Florida, which means that whoever won would win the presidency. So the Supreme Court of Florida says, we've got to keep counting. Let us count until every vote is counted. There's no rush. This is November. We have until March if we have to. So let's wait We can do what we have to do. We have at least until January, so give us time. So the Bush campaign basically says, no, we got to certify the votes right now. Why? Because he was ahead by 300 votes at that point. So he pushes for a court case where Bush sues the Gore campaign saying, we got to stop the vote. The Supreme Court agrees to hear the case, and in a 5-4 decision, the 5 Republican judges say, nope, sorry, we got to stop counting the votes right now. And they stop counting the votes, and Bush wins the presidency. So I think that's a pretty interesting case. And there's a really famous dissent in that case, where one of the justices who was on the losing side says, the Supreme Court has now destroyed itself. We are now a political body. We are no longer above politics. By making this decision, we've made a big mistake here. And then, of course, the question is, is Bush the legitimate president? And I think for Bush, September of 9/11 sort of makes his presidency. Like from that point on, he's seen as we got to rally around him, even if he wasn't the guy we voted for. We're now fighting this war against Al Qaeda, and we need him to sort of lead us. So that's sort of where that comes from. Yeah. Well, there were so many candidates, and if you look at around the country, there are lots of places where voting irregularities are just like they're crazy. Like the way they design the ballots, or they're confusing. There's no uniformity to the way voting is done because the Constitution says that each state gets to decide how it organizes its voting, which is part of this case. Because if the state Supreme Court said we should keep voting, the people on the side for Gore in the Supreme Court case said the Constitution gives no authority for us to stop this vote. Like they should be able to count the votes as much as they want. And so it was kind of an interesting thing. Ironically, or I guess not ironically, but maybe conveniently, the governor of the state of Florida at the time of this election was George Bush's brother, Jeb Bush. So that added even more controversy to it, that you've got the brother of the candidate really in charge of how the votes are counted in that state. So it was pretty controversial. Yeah. Sure. I don't think you need to know much about the space race beyond the fact that it's sort of an offshoot of the Cold War in a way. It's sort of a race to get to the moon. But I think it's interesting because it really shows the development of American technology, that we are able to get there first. That we are able to, even though Sputnik is the first satellite to circle the Earth and it's a Soviet satellite, the Americans sort of regroup and sort of try to beat the Soviets to the moon. And actually, unless you believe the conspiracy theories, that it didn't really happen. I had a student in Tennessee that was convinced that the moon landing was like all fake. And on his final essay for like 3 pages, he like wrote me the argument why it was all like a sham and it was all like. He gave me like links to websites to look at and stuff. So, but I think the space race, just as an example, from the space race, you get the internet. So I mean that's a good example of it. Huh? He did well in the class overall, so I didn't want to hold his conspiracy theories against him. Yeah. 1980. So it fits in that same time that Reagan's sort of trying to rebuild American spirit again, and the whole idea that we can beat the Soviets, it conveniently fits in the Winter Games of 1980. But I think you're right to bring that up because it's interesting that the Miracle on Ice happens. We're really feeling bad about ourselves, right? 68, the assassinations, JFK in 63 assassinated, Watergate in the 70s. There was like a gas crisis in Carter's administration. The Iranian hostage crisis happened in Carter's administration. So we were feeling really bad about ourselves as a country. And so Reagan comes in, Grandpa's going to bring us back, and then the Miracle on Ice happens, and it's sort of like it all fits in. Yeah.
Like, who was in charge of the USSR during this time?
Well, it changed pretty quickly. Like, the ones you should remember would be Khrushchev and Gorbachev. So Khrushchev is during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Gorbachev is during the fall of the Soviet Union. Any other questions from the board? Yeah, I mean, the Clinton impeachment, if you want to know about that, Bill Clinton had an affair with one of his interns, Monica Lewinsky. He first says that he didn't. He first argues that he didn't. There's a famous news conference. There's a famous news conference where he like wags his finger at the camera and says, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Monica Lewinsky." Then, of course, as time goes on, more and more comes out that he actually did, and she had sort of kept a record of everything that happened, and she testifies that it actually occurred. and then he goes under deposition and has to testify, and then has to go in front of the American people and say, okay, well, actually, we didn't actually have sex, but it depends on what you define sex as and all this other stuff. So it's this big embarrassment. And basically, the Republicans argue that he lied under oath, and he argues that he didn't, and he actually is impeached. Now, remember, impeachment is the charge of a crime. There have been two presidents in American history that have been impeached, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. Neither were removed from office, though, because the Senate never actually kicked them out in the end. So that's what that is. But yeah, that would be a good thing to talk about if you want sort of the constitutional crisis. Any other questions? Dalton?
Pretty much everything that went over is like listed on bullet points under part 2.
Yeah.
So is that pretty much all that?
There are probably 3 multiple choice questions from this period, and one of the videos is from this period.
Okay.
Okay.
So part 2 is not going to be this.
No.
Is the LBJ video instead of like Vietnam of the Great Society? What do you mean by that?
It means that Vietnam, the scandal of Vietnam, and sort of the fact that we were losing the war, killed all of these great programs that Lyndon Johnson was trying to make at the time. So he was trying to do all these good things at home, but foreign policy destroyed it on the outside. Okay? Now, just remember, when you come to class tomorrow, you can bring your Devil in the White City book, because in our discussion, I hope that somebody will recognize the reason I wanted that book for this last discussion of progress and white versus black and good versus bad. And I'm going to ask you in the discussion tomorrow, sort of in the epilogue, do we get any sense of that?
Are you posting questions or?
The question for the essay is the question we're going to discuss.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, the 2 classes.